CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy.
It's our 6th year of the African Conference on African Philanthropy. Everywhere where we go, we take the opportunity to experience the place, to experience the culture, but to also showcase the country in which we are doing the conference in. But we also use the opportunity to speak to delegates, record them for our conversations on African philanthropy. So welcome to the Conversations on African Philanthropy on the Nile River, where we are shooting some of our episodes. And in the next 5 days or so, we'll be speaking to different delegates, different actors, activists, foundations, government officials, researchers, you name it all. You want to find anything to do with African philanthropy, visit our channel on YouTube and other platforms, our Conversations on African Philanthropy. Welcome to another episode of our Conversations on African Philanthropy with me, Bhekinkosi Moyo. I'm excited, really excited to shoot this episode here in Cairo at the margins of the 6th African Philanthropy Conference. I'm joined by somebody that I've known for quite some time now, Barbara Ibrahim. Barbara, welcome to the Conversations.
Thanks for not mentioning how many years you've known me.
I was trying to calculate.
No, don't count.
I was trying to count how many years has it been. But yeah, Barbara and I have known each other for quite some time in the corridors of ISTR, the boardrooms, wings, etc. But also for me, most importantly, and this is why I'm interested in talking to you, is that Barbara is the founding director of the Gerhard Center for Philanthropy, Civic Engagement and Responsible Business, which is currently the host of this conference. I was saying before we started shooting that I always want to know the processes and really engage in the history of what we currently see now as the center. So you were in the thick of things, thinking about this. Maybe let's start about, what was the context and how did the idea of the center come about? Because centers like CAPSI and others are just recent.
Right.
So we're to study centers like this to think about what form and format should CAPSI look like, what are the issues that it should deal with, etc. But in your case, I'm assuming there was nothing.
That's true.
Yeah.
Across the African continent, across the Arab-speaking Middle East, there were no centers on philanthropy. There was no research association that pooled resources. There was really no infrastructure in 2 areas of the world where there was deep tradition for philanthropy. So the story of the Gerhard Center goes back to its founding 20 years ago in 2005 to early 2006. But the idea was incubating from the 1980s. And I can tell you I have a memo that proves that. I was a fresh PhD. I'd been hired at the Ford Foundation in its regional office, which was based here in Cairo. And my portfolio was not philanthropy. It really wasn't on anyone's radar in the foundation world either, very much. I was doing urban women's employment and gender studies at universities. But John Gerhard was the regional representative in the early 1980s. And he is an Africanist who had spent his formative years in Botswana, he was in South Africa right after the end of apartheid. Yeah. John's wife, Gail Gerhard, is a great historian of the ANC, highly regarded in Southern Africa. So he had the seeds of an idea for something that would support both civic engagement, which he called public participation, and philanthropy. But it was just an idea. So he and I exchanged a couple of memos while I was doing other things, and really not so much came of it.
Yeah.
Fast forward, I had a career that included both the grant making at the Ford Foundation and then 15 years of grant seeking at the International Population Council, where we were doing research, advocacy around youth issues, something that CAPSI has very much picked up on now, and I'm delighted to see that. but other demographic issues like migration and women's reproductive health. So I'd seen both sides of the coin of the funding relationship. And at about that time, Egypt was going through a lot of turmoil around the push for a more open democratic society and an aging regime that wasn't interested in change. And my husband, a sociologist who had a democracy center, ended up in prison. And what were the main charges against him? That he accepted foreign funding to do the work on human rights, democracy promotion. And why was that? It was obvious to all of us who got involved then in his 3-year case that it was because there were no indigenous sources of funding for difficult conversations, ethnic relations, refugee situations, human rights, democracy.
Yeah.
So then this old seed of an idea about a philanthropy support center was back in my head. By then, John Gerhardt had left the Middle East, did more work at the Ford Foundation in New York, and was back at AUC as its president by sheer coincidence.
Yeah.
So we started having these conversations again.
And this is because I'm trying to kind of have a sense of time, because the same John actually opened the South Africa Ford Foundation office in the early 90s. So 1993.
He opened that office.
He opened that office.
Because he had deep experience in Southern Africa and because of his wife's reputation. So now we're talking, however, about 2000 to 2003.
Okay.
And those were the years of my husband's struggle with the regime in Egypt and the beginning of these new conversations. Very sadly, John got ill, had to return to New York, and passed away far too young. But his successor, another Ford Foundation colleague, was very open to the idea of a center that would be university-based, because private universities, as we all know, have a little bit more room to maneuver in these societies than national universities, and that would combine research with helping a young generation of scholars at AUC to think about civic engagement and what citizenship meant, and teaching civic engagement to young people. How would that look in an ideal society? And we decided from the outset it would be regional. It would serve all of the Arabic-speaking countries because they were all in the same situation. Deep traditions of fairly individualized religious-based giving, or community-based giving, which was also very strong, but not the more modern tradition of forming registered foundations. So that's the impetus. 20 years now, come early 2026, 20 years since we opened the doors. And in the beginning, AUC gave me the mandate of raising all of the funding for my center. As we went along, as we proved ourselves, AUC picked up my salary as the center director, which made, of course, things a lot easier for me to do fundraising. But also, I think was a signal that AUC found they got great benefit from a center that combined academic research and tried to put that on the map in the MENA region, with training next generation young people to be more civically engaged. So the kind of things that we did over the first 10 years when I was there as the director, on the AUC campus, we set up something called community-based learning. This is very popular in the United States, where there are thousands of courses, but it was a new idea in Egypt. And that would be that instead of doing library research at the end of a semester's course, students would, along with their faculty, plan a community-based engagement in which they were giving something back to an NGO or another civic cause, but they were learning in the process. And they would be graded on their reflections, not on the service because they're young and they're just getting started, but on the way they reflected and learned from that service experience. And to make it interesting for the NGOs that would be participating in this, we offered them capacity building training, we listened to their issues, and we tried to help them smooth out their own fundraising journeys. So that was something we were doing on the AUC campus.
Yeah.
We also started a leadership program for young people that had an interest in the nonprofit sector so that they wouldn't be lured into a bank as they graduated. And we gave them very intensive leadership training under the name of the Lazord program.
Yeah.
On the research side, we were really starting not from zero, because there were individual researchers, and we early on knew about you and a few other people across Africa. But there was no way of knowing about each other, learning from each other, or thinking of ourselves as a field. So the first thing we did in the early 18 months was to do a survey of philanthropic institutions in 7 countries.
Yeah.
In the Gulf, in Lebanon, Palestine, Egypt, and Sudan. And publishing that book kind of put us on the map. And I would urge, startups in a new field like this to think about field building and think about having signature publications. It went a long way.
Yeah.
And now that is a kind of go-to, because there's been very little of a Pan-African, Pan-Arab nature after that. And then we started an annual research conference. It was called Takaful, and we moved to different Arab capitals to hold it. And we really scoured the PhD programs, Arabs that might be in diaspora doing research, wherever we could find them, and urged them to present papers, to do panels, and we gave the PhD students some support to get there. I think all of these are ideas that are rather ordinary right now, but it was new at the time we were doing it. And so Takaful became a place where scholars built a field, thought about themselves as doing philanthropy research or civic engagement research, instead of just being sociologists isolated in a department where that wasn't really happening. So it was a very exciting time to be doing the work. We were noting that after roughly the beginning of the 2000s, foundations in the name of a family member were coming up. There were a growing number of them. And so we started actually doing some guidelines for how that could be done, what were the legal parameters of starting a more modern private foundation. We also didn't want to neglect the religious leaders, because they had kind of held the key to how zakat and awqaf could be unlocked for broader purposes. So one of my colleagues, who's actually here in this conference and was a young researcher in our center, brought together the sheikhs in Egypt and started talking to them about the importance of reinterpreting what had been 6th century ideas about appropriate zakat. And we did it very slowly, with a lot of respect for what they were doing. But there were some pretty interesting experiences as the sheikhs came to our campus for the first time and interacted with us. But the timing couldn't have been better, because Egypt in 2011 had its revolution. And a new constitution was being written. And awqaf, to give an example, had been frozen in Egypt since the early 50s. It was not allowed. And there was an opportunity to have that discussion then within the Constitutional Drafting Committee. Heba Abu Shneif, my colleague, who I'm mentioning to you, went late at night and she Xeroxed papers that had been written with the help of these sheikhs about how awqaf is an essential pillar of Islam, why it should be legalized, why it should be a Muslim's right, not just a privilege, to set up awqaf. And we got that article into the Constitution, even though it was highly debated, because that was a time when the Muslim Brotherhood was very politicized, and people wanted to be sure this did not have any political roots. So having a university-based research center, the kind of careful work that we had laid with Sheikhs of Al-Azhar and elsewhere made the difference.
Yeah. And also,
so those are some of the stories.
Yes, beautiful, beautiful. Because for me, I'm also, so other than the programs that then come up, it's actually the process of bringing the sheikhs, having to input into the constitution drafting. But also, I would be keen to also, because what we have not spoken about is the state of philanthropy in Egypt, maybe at the time. I mean, we spoke about the rise of high net worth individuals, and now we've got groups such as the Saudis Foundations, we've got community foundations also that were coming up at some point. So at the time when you are setting up this, what are the conversations with other stakeholders? So you've spoken about the sheikhs, the university, but the conversations maybe with donors, conversations with the local communities, conversations with policymakers, etc., etc. So what are some of those conversations as far as you can remember?
And I was just using one example because it was an exciting one where we actually had a big win that we didn't anticipate when we started the project. No, very early on, and of course Egypt was one of the countries that we included in the early survey and the book that we published, which was called From Charity to Social Change, so you could see the kind of narrative that we were trying to build. And we surveyed all the various types of philanthropy that existed in Egypt, from the very most informal community funds, some of them burial societies, some of them rotating credit, all the way up to recently established high net worth individuals' family foundations, done very much in a tradition of endowment like US and European foundations. And the themes recurred at all these different levels. The government regulation was their main impediment. And the restrictions in those days were less than they are right now today, unfortunately. But it was, very difficult record keeping and reporting requirements to the government. You would submit an application to set up a foundation and you wouldn't hear back, or you'd hear back months and months later. So that made it really important to begin discussions with the Ministry of Social Solidarity, which was nominally responsible for these organizations and did actually the very best job I think they could under the circumstances. But there's politics involved, always. And our national regime was very leery of citizen action. And this is also very typical in more authoritarian regimes. So they were policing, that's the only word I can use for it, who could register, whether human rights organizations would get their credentials or not. So we started looking for workarounds along with our conversations with the authorities. And some of those that some organizations were using very effectively was a new corporation law that had come in the wake of opening the economic regime in Egypt to foreign investors, that made it quite easy to register as a company. And they even had a category that was called a social or a civic company. And lawyers' offices were using it, and other types of businesses were using it. But nonprofits started to use that for-profit registration as a workaround. And we quietly promoted that without printing it because we didn't want to be stopped. And sure enough, around the time of my husband's case, because he had opened his research center on democracy and social change under that rubric, that loophole was closed. And I would say that today what has happened is that as the environment for startups or for expanding nonprofit work has gotten even narrower in Egypt, unfortunately, a lot of young, entrepreneurial and socially aware young people are doing startups in the social investing sector. And they're just calling themselves a company, and they're paying their taxes, but they have a social purpose, and they're often cross-subsidizing what they do. So it's not a very happy environment right now, but that's a little bit of the trajectory of where we've come.
Yeah, and so setting up a center is not a child's play. Definitely lots and lots of barriers, challenges that, you would have faced in the beginning, but also throughout your tenure. Maybe let's talk a bit of about some of those barriers and challenges that you faced.
Well, I've never set up an NGO, but I have been a supporter of many organizations that tried to.
Yeah.
And I have become a believer that where you can do citizen action informally, where you've got in-kind participation or community participation, if there's no need to register and what you're doing is legally allowed within the confines of the
law,
the regulatory framework that you operate in, why not just operate?
Yeah.
If you cannot get the national authorities permission to do a piece of research, do it by telephone, by random telephone numbers. Find a way to get your data or to register your organization that is not illegal, but also is a workaround. At the moment, the situation is so dire that, for example, the Arab Foundation's Forum, which was starting up at about the same time, a little bit later than the Gerhardt Center, and that was going to be our membership association across the Arab-speaking countries that would strengthen the network and the idea of foundations and would promote and lobby better regulatory environments. So the Arab Foundation's Forum, for example, funded a project in Lebanon that was very close to getting a much better nonprofit law on the books, and then all of the difficulties that we know Lebanon is facing right now happened. But so that's important. I think networks are critical because they can be registered outside the region. The foundations that want to support philanthropy can support that network, and then it can be an intermediary to capacity building in the sector. So networking has become, I think, a very important concept as the formation of a registered foundation becomes more difficult. I'm sorry I can't be more optimistic than that. As you know, the Arab region is facing incredible turmoil and a lot of informal efforts right now in Egypt are supporting the influx of displaced Palestinians here. I have a project that's working with university students to give them some research skills and then help them document what's happening inside of Gaza. And at the same time memorialize their villages, which are gone.
So when you look back to today, you look because you realize that when you started, there were probably only centers in the global north, US, maybe a few in Europe, but today,
a couple in Asia.
But today, when you look at the globe, or the philanthropic ecosystem, you see so many centers that have come up, including ours.
Exactly. I think it's 78 and counting that we're aware of, and there's probably more we're not aware of.
So looking back, what are some of the reflections on the evolution of academic centers on philanthropy? As somebody who probably started with just a couple of examples that you would learn from. Because when I was setting up CAPSI, I was basically spoiled for choice because I had to go and study, American forms of centers. I would study, Gerhardt. I would go and study the Europeans, study some in, Brazil, Latin America. So I had a vast, space to really take time to decide where do we even locate.
You had a great luxury.
The center. So we had luxury to even decide, okay, are we going to locate in humanities or, economics or this or that? I don't think you had that much luxury. So, but maybe a bit of reflections for you now that you sit with so many of these centers. I mean, you meet them at ISTR, you meet them at Wings and whatever the case might be. And you are looking at them and thinking, wait a minute, this is where we are, but
Yeah, I mean, it's extremely heartening because I think we all have come to recognize that intermediaries play a role. They're
Yeah.
not just siphoning off funding and
Yeah.
paying their staffs. They really can distribute funding when it's become difficult to do that, do a lot of capacity building, and make startups feel like they're not alone. You now operate in an ecosystem that the Gerhardt Center didn't have, except if we turned to the West, as you've noted. It's really interesting. I've been consulting with a group in Eastern Europe who are very concerned about the creeping authoritarianism that replaced all of that early optimism at the fall of the Soviet Union, and are trying to think about how they could open a very effective social investing support center, and how should they go about it. So I'm always really happy to be able to offer my 2 cents about what makes sense. And I have suggested that they look very closely at whether there is a private university base that they could use. Because when you register independently as a standalone entity, you really are very much at the whims of the politics of that country. And it may be fine for 3 or 4 years, and then the winds blow in the wrong way. So if you want sustainability, and nothing is now certain, as we can see from what's happening to universities in the United States. But I find that that is a safe space. You can discuss and talk about and publish almost anything normally within that academic space. You can combine your academic work with advocacy because you have the data, and you can speak very persuasively or write very persuasively about the need for regulatory change, or for human rights organizations to do their work in a different way, or whatever else it is. So that's one advice that I now give. It's not always ideal, but I think it solves some of the problems and creates a sustainable future. And I'm really glad that you're in a place that seems to be very supportive of what you do in Southern
Definitely
Africa.
supportive, but I also wanted to unpack a bit of that with you, because in our case, being located in a university, particularly in a business school, has got these huge advantages in terms of so many things: access to the business sector, access to key facilities that our students really need, but also the name of the university. It's a
It opens doors.
It opened doors and all of that. But at the same time, I wanted to find out what were some of the limitations of being located in a university, because I find that as much as there are these huge advantages, because our center, and I suppose even in your case, was conceived from outside academia, it had to bring along a huge constituency of practitioners. And being located at a university at times as a way of unwillingly excluding, either by processes or by policies, the practitioners that you actually had in mind when setting up the center. So I find that tension with CAPSI as we progress, that I've got to be mindful that as much as this is an academic center, so it's situated in a university, there's a bigger constituency that needs to benefit from it. And that constituency at times is not students.
I agree.
It's practitioners, it's foundations, it's NGOs,
it's community,
it's communities,
leaders that don't speak our jargon,
language.
do they?
Yeah. So how did you navigate that?
In the very beginning, I want to say 3 things. In the very beginning, I was reporting to the provost. And that was ideal. Because I wasn't inside a school, and therefore there were times when I felt I was not privy to the kind of information that flows, through a school. On the other hand, I wasn't identified as business or as humanities, and I could work across with faculty who wanted to set up these community-based learning opportunities. Our staff had access to everyone equally. So that was ideal. It wasn't ideal, however, from the administration's point of view, because they want to be able to evaluate the center director
yeah.
on academic grounds, and it's just simpler for them to locate all of the research centers within a school. So that's what happened as I was leaving. There wasn't a big focus on responsible business before.
Right,
it had been an element in our program, but it wasn't a main focus. But at the urging of the president and the provost at that time, we moved into a school. So if you can get yourself affiliated as broadly as possible, I mean, that would be my advice to new. It really does help. And you're above the fray in a very interesting way. The second thing I would say is do something very early on to bring the community on campus, because that's good for your students and that's good for everybody to see the presence of the community. So several of our early community-based learning projects had to do with this desert around the new campus, which was only beginning to be settled, and bringing, representatives of those stakeholders onto campus and hear from them and writing up their experiences. So that's really important. And then I also think jargon, in these past 5 days, we've had such rich conversations, but, endlessly talking about decolonizing various different fields and subjects. And it's a very important idea, and it's very current, and it helps to explain. I was just saying to a colleague this morning, we used to think of Palestine as an exceptional case. Well, now it fits very clearly into settler colonial theory as well as praxis. But we can't talk that way when we get out beyond the walls. And so I really always urged my students and my staff, especially in their writing, to avoid jargon of our field or of others, fields as much as they could, and just write in plain old Arabic, write in plain old English, and speak that way to reach them. The other thing, that's good for now.
So maybe just as we get closer to winding down, beyond the center, obviously the center was connected to the other parts of the world and to the other conversations and processes. And like I said, you've been a strong member of certain institutions like the ISTR, Wings, and others. And I'm sure you've been monitoring some of the developments and the changes. So we are in 2025. Philanthropy is expressing itself in probably completely different ways than it did in the past. So any noticeable changes that over the last couple of years, as you have noted, and you are still in the field yourself, one of the most experienced people that I've met in this field. So from a historical perspective, what are some of those major pivots or changes in the field of philanthropy that you could speak to?
One that I think of immediately is that a lot of the discussion 20 years ago was how do we bring traditional local philanthropy or cultural ideas about giving into some of the more modern institutional ways in which giving could become more impactful. It could reach bigger scale. And all of those ideas were very prominent. What I think has happened in the last 10 years, and I find it very important and also threatened perhaps, is to think about macro level agencies and processes that have a direct impact on philanthropy. Cross-border giving and how it is either penalized or encouraged by financial regulatory agencies. The de-risking of philanthropic giving has become a really important field, I think, because if we don't get that right, if the Arab Foundations Forum cannot open a bank account in anywhere in Europe because they have the word Arab in their name, we've got a problem. One of the ones I faced very early on is that the word American is in the name of my institution, and that immediately throws up flags
Yeah.
especially for some of the more progressive entities that we really want to be, have in the conversation.
Yeah.
So we had to go out of our way to prove that we were, we'd been around for 100 years and we didn't have any government ties and. And now what's happening, to go back to our example of the macro and the kind of things that we've been discussing the last 4 days, corruption, illegal funding flows across borders, getting at ways in which we could think about the circular economy and not become the victims anymore, but become the asset bearers as we think about Africa. I'm worried about all of those international and multinational channels by which we've fought those battles, because the rule of law and the institutions that used to govern us seem now to me to be so threatened. And if the president of the largest, largest superpower in the world can just ride roughshod over the United Nations, over laws of war and crime, it doesn't bode very well. So I think all of us who are in institutional positions like you and I have been, I think we really have to keep the spotlight on those institutions, not constantly be criticizing the UN, but thinking, how do we support it? Because the work of the World Bank and the UN and these other institutions, certainly the ICJ and the International Criminal Court, are absolutely essential, and they're under threat. So, something to think about.
So, what keeps Barbara busy today, several years after stepping down from the center?
I made a decision when I retired formally, and it's now been 11 years, that I would only serve on boards if I really loved the work of the organization. So I've been very privileged.
Selective,
The International Center for Not-for-Profit Law is an incredible organization. ISTAR, because it's a society that brings researchers from China to Latin America together, and has PhD support. I think that's a really important one. So I've served on boards like that, and Wings and others. Right now, I'm using my research hat and the fact that I still have links at this university to do a very informal project that responds to the refugees from Gaza in Egypt, who are university age and whose pathways to getting a degree have been completely blocked. Their universities are in rubble. Some of them can't even get transcripts to continue their journey. And yet we all feel kind of helpless to do very much. So we mobilized 4 faculty members at AUC who completely did this as volunteers, some of their graduate students. We developed a short course on qualitative research and interviewing skills. And what started out as a way just to maybe bring those students together and give them something meaningful to do, because they were in very poor housing situations. They don't have the money to even sit in cafes, and meet. That has turned into a full-fledged research program in which 11 Gazan students are now interviewing 50 displaced Gazans inside and in diaspora, so that we'll have their voices at the table when the reconstruction process begins. And our second phase of work is going to be design studios. So we'll bring Palestinian architects and social scientists and social workers together for 3 intensive weeks while they think about state-of-the-art knowledge about how can we shortcut the reconstruction and the rebuilding and the reconstituting of Palestine out of the destruction that we've seen. And so that's what I'm up to. It's extremely fulfilling, and uses some of my, networks and Rolodex to get things done.
What are your takeaways from the 3 days of the main conference? I'm not sure if you did take part in the academic conference.
I was there,
So,
very
so it's 5 days for you. What are some of your key takeaways?
First of all, I am incredibly impressed by the younger generation here. And many of them were giving their papers in those first 2 days. The caliber of their work, the theoretical grounding, the methodological appropriateness, for what they were studying, all of that was incredibly impressive to me. And I think that, again, intermediaries like CAPSI have been responsible for a lot of that. So that was the first thing that struck me. This is being done by young Africans at a caliber that we would, be jealous of in many parts of the Arab world. So more power to you. I'm also really impressed by the energetic ways that people are thinking about maybe what's happening to international aid flows is going to be a plus when we look back on it 10 years from now. This is what lit a fire under us to do things differently and to really think outside of the boxes that we've thought in. So I think that's been a really important takeaway from the conference. And just the energy. It's incredible. You've dealt with 40-degree days and no shade where you had your lunches, and everybody's kept in good spirits, and that's terrific.
So, Barbara, the reason why I really wanted to grab you and have this conversation is because when we held our last conference in Zimbabwe last year, and we were thinking of a venue, and Egypt came to our mind, I immediately said, we have a center on philanthropy. If there's anyone who can host us, it's got to be a center that is grounded on philanthropy. And the Gerhard Center was what we opted for. And for me, it's actually a very emotional moment to have brought this 6th version of the conference to the first center on philanthropy in the continent.
Yeah, I agree.
And for
it's
me
a full
to actually
circle.
Yes, to actually have you speak about the formation of the center, and here we are, the center has hosted this massive conference. I think for the first time, we have had presentations from senior government officials. We have had presentations like this, but not at the level where we have had the former Vice President of Nigeria.
That was a fantastic
The
talk.
Deputy Prime Minister of Zimbabwe on AI, the United Nations, I think UNA's Director, Winnie, and so forth and so on. So
and today an Egyptian representative of the Ministry of Social Solidarity. It's very important for them to see the strength of the philanthropy sector.
So thank you so much, Barbara, for setting up the center, but for also journeying with most of us, knowingly or unknowingly, until today.
Well, I hope we continue on and on. And I hope that we can include North Africa more substantively than we have in the past. It's not easy. It's Francophone. Their communication styles are very different, but there's a lot going on in Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria, and maybe that can be one of our joint goals going forward.
Great. Thank you so much, Barbara. That was Barbara Ibrahim. We interviewed her in her capacity as the founding director of the Gerhard Center on Philanthropy, Civic Engagement, and Responsible Business. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to the CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy.